With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halverson.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning at the AgNet News Hour. Coming up later, we're talking about pollinator health and how to help our honeybee populations. But we start today with a conversation on the Farm Bill and specialty crops. Joining us on the phone is Rebeckah Freeman Adcock, Vice President of U.S. Government Relations for the International Fresh Produce Association. Thank you for fitting me into your schedule. I appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
So we wanted to talk about the Specialty Crop Caucus and the Farm Bill, which, of course, the extension has now expired for the Farm Bill. We don't have a new Farm Bill yet. But once we do finally get a Farm Bill, what are some of the proposed changes for the specialty crops that you're hoping to see?
Yeah, so we have a lot that we're hopeful for in an upcoming Farm Bill, and really both the House and the Senate have done a wonderful job of including the priorities for the specialty crop industry in either their draft on the House side or in their proposed frameworks on the Senate side. And some of the most significant things that we're looking for are really about ensuring and increasing our grower and industry prosperity. We've been hit pretty hard by competition issues. Labor is a huge cost on the farm. Neither of these issues are necessarily things that we have either been able to convince Congress to do something about in this case of labor, and we don't always control the worldwide marketplace. So we have to look for other ways for the specialty crop growers in particular to maintain their viability, maintain their economic sustainability, in addition to all the other good things that they do on the farm. And to get there, we are looking at improvement and investment in research, in options for scaling and finding better ways of mechanization, and options that might help ease at least some of our concerns on labor. It won't fix everything, but it could ease some of the tremendous pressures we have there. We're looking at some new or novel ways to get at some better risk management tools. Right now, a significant portion of specialty crops are not they're either underinsured through the crop insurance options, or there is no crop insurance product at all for them. And in times as we are seeing now, like dramatic emergency and natural disaster situations, not having access to things like good and substantial crop insurance options delay any sort of response and any sort of ability to recover that much longer. And then you have to look only to disaster assistance and things like that are at the whim of Congress, and it take a very long time. We're looking again at those investments in research and the Specialty Crop Research Initiative, which has been woefully underfunded and overprescribed for, well over a decade. And everyone agrees it is long due over time to make a tremendous amount of investment there and try to get specialty crops where they need to be comparable to other parts of the industry. The specialty crops supply the food and the goods that are supposed to make up half your plate from a nutritional standpoint. But yet depending on how you want to measure it, what you want to include, whether in the nutrition programs or not, we make up somewhere between 5 and 10% of the total spending in the Farm Bill. We don't really think that matches up very well with the half the plate and the nearly half the farm gate value for cash crops we represent. And so we have some ideas on expanding our specialty crop block grant program, which sends specialty crop dollars directly to states, often to state departments of agriculture, to figure out more localized ways on the ground, state by state, to help the industry. We have some ideas to work on how we manage and get more flexibilities on everything from response to climate events and how we are learning more about the contributions and opportunities in that space for our members to do even more. We already believe we do a great job on sustainability, but we know we have an opportunity to do more, and we want to show it. And we have some additional ideas on how we qualify for USDA programs. There's something called an adjusted gross income cap that really is a little more targeted toward very large absentee corporate kind of landowners that aren't necessarily operating at home and are perhaps receiving payments that people think they maybe shouldn't be under the Title I program. We're agnostic on that issue, but for us, the adjusted gross income limits are very low, and for our manner of operation, which is very high upfront cost, and sometimes our profitability is measured in an entirely different tax year, and so it artificially inflates or categorizes and limits our folks from being able to participate actually in some very core USDA programs, such as programs in conservation. There's even some participation on some emergency programs that our folks get kicked out of because they hit the AGI cap too soon, and we believe inappropriately for their scale of operation and what they do for the nation.
We're talking this morning with Rebeckah Freeman Adcock, the VP of U.S. Government Relations for the International Fresh Produce Association. We'll continue right after this.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
We're talking this morning with Rebeckah Freeman Adcock. She is the Vice President of U.S. Government Relations for the International Fresh Produce Association. Rebeckah, as you said, those AGI caps, a lot of the programs were not created with specialty crops in mind. And that has become a problem because specialty crops now need these programs just like every other crop does out there. And the AGI limits them so that they're not able to get it. Are people starting to understand this more?
We have a much better and broader understanding of why AGI is not a good way to measure, I guess, the prosperity in the specialty crop industry. And we think that there are some other ways that can be measured based on what percentage of your income is coming from, how involved you are in the operation. You shouldn't be penalized from being able to access, especially assistance or compliance assistance or guidance on conservation programs, things like that are good incentive and solid services and options and opportunities that the federal government has to offer. We don't think that is an appropriate place to start limiting acts just simply because someone has a lot of cost and then their return comes in a different calendar year, and so it looks there's an enormous profit when in fact they're barely making a small margin if they're lucky, just because of how it's measured on the tax year. We just don't think that's a good way of doing business. We are not a Title I commodity. We're not corn and soybeans. Those guys too probably aren't crazy about AGI for their own reasons, but the program and the resistance there, the aim really was more about what the perceived injustice was on that side of things, and it really does not match up well with the financial or practical or just accessible reality for specialty crop growers. And we do think that is, we've seen a few times historically, recently, at least for very specific disaster or emergency response programs where AGI was waived, and it was waived precisely because of the sorts of concerns that we're raising, is that it was not representative and it was limiting those who truly and earnestly needed assistance in order to maintain their operations at all through COVID, through trade challenges. And we believe that we have a good case to be made now to see how those programs played out and all the good that they did, that now is the time to reassess and evaluate and develop, if we are going to have AGI, at least one that is fairly those that are truly involved.
Yeah, and along the same lines, talking about crop insurance, it was made devastatingly clear how important crop insurance is with the hurricanes down south. And a lot of those hit in specialty crop areas because there's a lot of fruit and a lot of tree nuts and crops in those areas. Those growers don't have the same kind of protections that corn and soybean growers have in other parts of the nation. What kind of improvements can be made to help those growers out?
Yes, a finer point could not be made. That's the very reason that we want crop insurance to be accessible and available for growers is precisely for circumstances like this, where the market or Mother Nature deals them a dirty hand, and they're willing to expend their funds to protect their risk, but they need options on the table to do so. And we certainly have a significant number of our folks that don't even have an option. They couldn't buy insurance if they wanted it because simply the policies don't always exist. And even where they do, they're often not ideal and not really, they can be so expensive for various technical reasons within the structure of the program that it's not really worth the while to invest in that program. So we have actually 2 or 3 ideas out there. Some things like AGI are fairly simple fixes that makes things like the the under and non-insured program NAP at least somewhat available for emergency situations and more urgent situations. It doesn't fix the larger problem, but at least allows some eligibility, certainly for circumstances like now. And then we have a couple of other ideas that are changes literally to the structure of the rules that govern crop insurance. Now, the reality is the changes that would allow and create more robust coverage for crop insurance for specialty crops does require a federal investment. So there are some budgetary concerns, and so we're working through some of those, but they are literal structural changes that allow especially a bit of extra time and some guarantees to the actuarials without getting too far in the details. Basically, especially crops can be more challenging to assess and more challenging to insure because we often grow many different things on the same operation, whereas the Title I crops, the corn and soybean folks, tend to grow only 1 or 2 things on their operation. And so there's a lot more information, a lot more certainty for the insurers in that space to be able to predict and quantify and price those products. We recognize that problem, and so we realize it's going to take a bit of time to acquire the information, to acquire the expertise, and a little bit of risk on the side of the insurers during that time. And one of the many things we're asking for is some subsidizing or a grace period for the insurance industry to have the chance to do that and get those numbers right over time. That we believe is well worth it compared to having to try to constantly make up for losses with disaster assistance that often comes too little too late. And if we could get ahead of this, the investment in that type of program would allow folks to come into an insurance program and allow the insurers to feel confident that if they got off on their actuarial numbers a bit, that the government would make sure that they too were made whole while the producers were getting what they needed as well. And in a time to gather that data so that way we got better at how we insure and how we price things.
We're talking this morning with Rebeckah Freeman Adcock, Vice President of U.S. Government Relations for the International Fresh Produce Association. We'll continue the conversation right after this.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
We continue now with Rebeckah Freeman Adcock, Vice President of U.S. Government Relations for the International Fresh Produce Association. Rebeckah, let's talk about labor a little bit. As you said at the beginning of the interview, labor, there's just a lot that's needed for labor. Labor has always been an issue. There are fixes needed for H2A. What are some of the things that the organization would like to see to help labor for specialty crops?
Yeah, so for labor, we really are looking to the options for automation and mechanization. There are a lot of, you look throughout some of the larger swaths of America where you see some of the grain crops grown and you see very large pieces of equipment out there doing the work that used to be done by many people, 1 or 2 people can do for hundreds of acres. We don't, in a widespread way, have those sort of technologies in specialty crops. Again, that is because specialty is a little bit misnomer. It's really, we are the crops that people eat. We're not special, we're not niche, but we are a huge variety. And that is challenging for the technology industries to figure out a way to both find an automation or technology or robotics that helps ease the need for hand and manual labor while scaling it either across 1 or 2 products hopefully more, maybe something that's adaptable. But it is not just the upfront investment, but it's getting it into the marketplace and getting it in a form that is affordable for a producer to be able to bring into their operation to make that cut, because there's always going to be a transition between the automation and the need for actual hand farm labor. And that has really been the biggest challenge that we have seen in increasing and improving and expanding our ability to use automation, to use robotics, to use mechanization to help relieve some of those manual labor needs that we need in specialty crops. It's hard to pick a fragile fruit or vegetable with a machine in the same way you do with a human hand. And to do that requires a much higher level of technology and advancement and precision, quite frankly, and often those things mean expense than creating a very large combine that can deal with more durable products on a wider scale with just the change out of a couple of pieces of attachment.
Yeah, and then that all plays a little bit into the need for more research as well,
Yeah,
and research
absolutely.
funding. Yeah.
Absolutely. We have needs, and we really are treating these the and mechanization as a separate funding need. It is so important and so broad that although we do believe it will ultimately be part of SCRI, we think it should be a certain designated piece of that puzzle, because we have needs both in mechanization and we have the existing needs that already happened, that already exist in SCRI for pest management, for new breeds and new technologies to deal with disease resistance, to look at other sorts of production methods that are either more efficient or more sustainable, or to assess our contribution for climate, and not just our contribution, but our ability to also mitigate in climate. So there's a ton of research needs that we already had before you add the mechanization and research components.
So, for a final thought for our listeners, what would you want them to know about the needs for specialty crops, especially when it comes to the next farm bill?
The thing I would want them to know is, they should be putting half of their plate filled with the products that we provide to them in the grocery store. Specialty crops are some of the healthiest, most robust, most vibrant things that we can consume. And we know there's a market for that. And we need as much support and attention to ensure that we can continue to supply those products for the American consumer, and anything we have in excess for those around the world as well. And to do that, we need to be seen as an equal player and to receive similar equal resources to the balance of agriculture that's also doing their part to feed and clothe and fuel the world.
All right. Thank you so much for your time today, Rebeckah. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you once again to Rebeckah Freeman Adcock, the Vice President of U.S. Government Relations for International Fresh Produce Association. When we come back, we're talking about Honeybee Health. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
Joining us on the phone now is Matt Mulica, Senior Project Director with Keystone Policy Center and the Facilitator of the Honeybee Health Coalition. All right, we wanted to talk about honeybees and solar projects, and I did do an interview that you set me up with, as you said previously, and learned a little bit more about when you're installing solar and things to think about for honeybee health or for pollinator health in general. But I wanted to get another viewpoint from you, especially being with the Keystone Policy Center and also the coordinator for the Honeybee Health Coalition, why it's important to be thinking about pollinators when you're doing something like installing solar. And we're talking about large solar arrays, not just a couple solar panels on your house, but big projects. So let's start off with telling me, why is this important?
Sure. I think that the first thing is that bees support billions of dollars, especially managed honeybees, in agriculture every year. Imagine walking into your grocery store and a third of your fruits and vegetables and nuts are gone. So all your cucumbers, your melons, your peppers, your apples, blueberries, they're all disappeared. Your almonds are gone. And these 2.5 million hives that we have in North America support our food supply system. So every year when these plants are flowering, the a beekeeper comes up with an 18-wheeler and drops off the bees for, it depends on the crop, anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks or even longer. And those bees pollinate the food that we eat. And without them, we really don't have that healthy, nutritious supply of fruits and vegetables and nuts. Part of the equation of keeping these bees healthy is having forage for them. So these bees have to live on and adjacent to ag lands for the most part. There are these millions of hives that are honeybees, and then there's about 4,000 species of native bees. And these bees all need places to live, especially managed bees when they're not doing honey production and pollination services. And so solar provides a tremendous opportunity for co-benefits for both the solar operator and for beekeepers. For the solar operator, it's reduced management costs and a more attractive project. And for beekeepers, it's more forage opportunities.
So you put together this guide and it's really comprehensive. It covers a lot of different areas. What are some of the key points that people should be thinking about when they're considering putting out these solar arrays?
Specifically, this is a guide for large scale solar arrays. And that is not your community solar project. This is actually like grid level, 1,000 acre plus solar projects. And so it's estimated there are over 10 million acres of utility scale solar project that will be installed uh, in the next 10 years. And so that's a huge opportunity. And with that opportunity, come some challenges. So in these large scale solar arrays, you have a lower panel height and there's water availability issues. And so this guide really walks a solar developer through some of those complexities so they can see if this is right for their project. There's also a lot of benefits of increased carbon sequestration as we move from fossil fuels to renewables, enhanced water quality, reduced stormwater runoff. There's also beyond bees, there's grassland songbird habitat and health benefits. And as I said, just long-term reduced operation and maintenance costs for these sites. There's really a lot of multiple benefits that these projects can help with. And we think that as we're looking at these millions of acres that are going to be turned mostly from ag lands to large scale solar projects, that there's a huge opportunity to put in pollinator habitat underneath and around them.
And when we're talking about, like you said, thousands upon thousands of acres that will be going to solar arrays, it's important to be thinking about how to create a double purpose almost for this land as well. I think we all talk a lot about pollinators and about pollinator health and about planting an extra row for food for your pollinators and things like that. The solar projects seem like a natural fit to get some of that back out there as far as planting with pollinators in mind. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a huge potential to both native bees, managed bees, and as I said, grassland songbirds. It also is just more attractive. There has to be a vegetative cover underneath these solar arrays, and it might as well be flowers to reduce those management costs and to have those biodiversity benefits.
So can we talk about some of the other guidelines that the Honeybee Health Coalition has put together? Because it's not just solar that the coalition focuses on. You guys do a lot of good work. Is there anything else that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, sure. So the two main audiences of the Honeybee Health Coalition are beekeepers and farmers and landowners and ranchers. We have materials put together for both. Back in 2014, when the Honeybee Health Coalition was formed, and still through today, there's a lot of great organizations working on bee health. But there was no one organization that was at the intersection of agriculture and bee health. The corn growers and the soybean growers and the almond growers weren't necessarily talking with the beekeepers and having an environment to talk about the solutions to declining bee health. And so we have a number of initiatives. On the farmer side, we've developed best management practice guides for soybean growers, corn growers, apple growers, and canola growers. So how do you have a productive crop and also have healthy bees, both native and managed bees? And so that's really important. Ideas like planting forage on the sidelines of your farm and on all the benefits of doing that, providing clean water sources, having good pesticide stewardship. If there are bees placed in and around your lands, which many, if I'm not going to say most, but many farms have bees placed in and around their operations, and knowing where to place them, placing them upstream of the prevailing winds, so there you reduce the negative impacts from pesticides. As I said, having water sources that are clean and free of pesticides, and then just adding that extra forage, and just good communication between the beekeeper and the farmer is really important. On the beekeeper side, we have a number of resources. One of the pests that hit bees the hardest is the Varroa mite, and they carry a number of diseases. And so we have guides on Varroa mite control and how do you test and treat for mites. How do you keep your hives healthy? We have the best management practices for hive health, which is, I call the first 80 pages of beekeeping. We have a decision support tool for Varroa where you click through 5 questions and you see what options are available. Then there's a number of other pests and diseases that we have guides for, such as American and European foul brood and small hive beetle. And so we're really trying to hit all aspects of hive health. And really that comes down to good hive management, plenty of access to forage and a nutritious diet for pollinators, and then pesticide stewardship. So those 3 things are really what's causing this bee health decline that we're working so vigorously on.
And a lot of this information is available right there on your website, right?
Yes, honeybeehealthcoalition.org. It's all free, and we just put it out there and hope that people use it. And we have various, as I said, tools and resources. And the idea is that it's not wholesale system change. We're not asking farmers or beekeepers to do something that is different from what they're doing now, that it's not implementable. We worked with, for example, the National Corn Growers Association to develop the guide, or the United Soybean Board to develop the soybean guide. And so they know what their growers are willing and able to do, knowing that in all of these farm systems, the farmers are the original conservationists, but their margins are thin. And so they're not going to be able to do something that really negatively impacts their bottom line, and unless it makes conservation sense as well as business sense.
Great. And that website, one more time, Matt?
honeybeehealthcoalition.org.
Matt Mulica, Senior Project Director of the Keystone Policy Center and the Facilitator of the Honeybee Health Coalition. This is the AgNet News Hour, and we'll be back in just a moment. This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. For the Conservationist of the Year, what goals would you like to see occur this year?
So this is continuing work as the Certified Crop Advisor Conservationist of the Year. They're looking for certified crop advisors who are trying to aid farmers in getting information or conservation practices. One thing we've identified that is keeping farmers from getting conservation practices is actually just information and products. The current federal regulations actually were written in the 1950s. And at that time, those rules were only restricting fertilizers and pesticides. They didn't put into account other developing technologies such as plant biostimulants and some of these newer technologies we're using in agriculture. And so for 2024, our goal is to really help change the laws that are impacting biostimulant regulation to allow them to be used and treated as a fertilizer, not as a pesticide.
So what does that process look like to go through that and get that change to be where it needs to be?
Well, actually, there's a very long on-ramp. We've been working on this since 2014, and the bricks that we've laid on this path are now hopefully being included in the Farm Bill. So more than anything now, it's just supporting the work we've already done, trying to get legislators aware of the problem and hopefully enact those rules. There's an act right now by California regulators. It's called the Plant Biostimulant Act. And so the best thing that farmers can do is call up and say, hey, we support this language. This is going to give us more tools to enact those conservation practices and have more products available to us.
To get to know more about Live Earth Products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
For this segment, we go to Susan Littlefield, who's talking with Josh Linville, the Vice President of Fertilizer for StoneX. He's talking about the impacts of Hurricane Helene on the phosphate markets.
Yeah, we just had this near shot by Helene. It looked like it was going to be a little bit of a bigger deal. And of course, for like the outer islands and things like that, they saw storm surge, they've seen damage. And to your point, you never want to sit there and make statements about it and sound so cold hearted, like you don't care about the people, you only care about the fertilizer industry. But because that's not the case. But from a fertilizer standpoint, dodged another bullet. Helene went north. It didn't touch manufacturing. It didn't really hurt anything from the dock. We've lost limited tonnage production capabilities down there. I don't think we get lucky twice in a row. Milton is taking a direct shot. This thing is climbing to a Cat 4, Cat 5 very, very quickly. This is not a glancing blow. Storm surge is set to be enormous. This one spooks me. This is one that we saw Friday, Saturday, started seeing updates, and this is kind of that one you always talk about, you always theorize about, and you hope you never actually have to talk about it in actuality. But here we are.
So, what does this mean to agriculture from the perspective of you watching Hurricane Milton come in? Obviously, from this fertilizer perspective with phosphates, what should we be concerned about?
Yeah, it's the phosphate market in general. We always talk about generalities like North America phosphate production or U.S. phosphate production. When we make statements like that, we're talking about Florida. Florida is where it all is. Now, there are some smaller mines out there, and those mines are fantastic for those regions. But when you look at the overall numbers, it's Florida. And to your point, this storm path has it dead to rights in its crosshairs. Now, anything can happen over the next, say, 48 hours. But as of right now, it just doesn't get a whole lot worse than what they're predicting today. Um, Now, we like to always sit there and say, Florida, they know hurricanes come. It's a part of their DNA. And so when you build these types of facilities, you build them with hurricanes in mind, with winds and maybe even some storm surge. But you can only engineer so much. I mean, if this thing comes across as a category 4 or 5, it's really hard to foresee a situation where there isn't some amount of damage to the facilities. But that isn't even where we truly get nervous. It's more the people. Your facility can come through largely unscathed. But if your people's homestead, their families and things like that, if everything is wrecked there, that's where their attention needs to be placed. Those people need to be at home cleaning up, getting their families somewhere safe, getting them fed, and everything else, the bare essentials. That takes precedence over running a facility. So even if the damage to the facilities are not what some are fearing today, if it is on the personal side, it doesn't matter. It may be the exact same effect, which is very unfortunate given that we're less than 30 days away from November, which is the start of fall application.
Where do you see supplies at this point? Is there a push to get supplies moved that are available to be moved at this point ahead of the hurricane?
I think so. They're probably doing everything they possibly can, and they have been anyway. Phosphate supplies across the nation, across North America, have been very, very tight. We've still seen a large lack of imports, and demand has been improving the closer to fall that we get. Retailers and suppliers have been very reluctant all summer to take in product because you look at the price of phosphate. It's high versus historical pricing. It's high versus grain pricing, and farmer economics were terrible. So demand destruction was a very common story that we had been discussing. Well, since the start of harvest, we've seen grain prices up. They're not near what they had been, but they're at least off of the bottom. That made people feel better. We're also pulling off massive, massive yields. Everything we've kind of been talking about is coming true. Well, if you pull up big yields, you're pulling off big nutrients that you have to replace to grow big yields again next year. So those two situations have actually been improving our demand outlook for phosphate right as we start entering that envelope when it gets too late to really bring in anything additional. So now you start to overlay that with this hurricane, which who knows what effects it could have. The timing doesn't get much worse than where we're at today.
So, as you look at the big picture, Josh, of the fertilizer, and you look at areas like, for example, Nebraska, Iowa, the Dakotas that are extremely dry. Let's not forget Kansas and Oklahoma. They're going to be doing their fall applications, but the ground is so, brittly dry. Are we just like blowing money into the wind when we're putting on these fall applications?
Yeah, and that's why I always try to kind of pump the brakes on making some wide arching statements like, oh, everybody needs to listen to this from the exact same ear. Because every single person listening is going to have it a little bit different. Even if you're very close in proximity, every farm operation, every county, every state, every field is going to be a little bit different. And that's why everybody needs to listen to it from that 30,000 foot level and then take that down to the ground and say, okay, so what does this mean for this field and that field and for this operation? The dry conditions out there, it's a very significant concern, not only from putting on dry phosphate potash, but think about it from an anhydrous standpoint. We're expecting a very, very good fall run, but if you can't pull a toolbar through the field and close the soil behind you, you're wasting money.
What is your thought globally on what's happening right now with the Middle East and nitrogen prices and urea, seeing what's happening there?
Yeah, last week we saw global urea prices starting to trigger going higher. And of course, it was right on the back of this Iranian missile attack on Israel. Everybody got spooked. Everybody saw prices going up, and rightfully so. When you look at the Middle East and North Africa region, just that small part of the map, 1 out of every 2 tons of urea exported in the world comes from those 2 small areas. So it was right to see that and get nervous. But from my point of view, from our point of view, that was not the actual cause of prices going up. We have been going through a lot this year with the EU region. Production is still 75% of normal. In the urea market, that's about 3.5 million tons less than normal. Chinese exports, which are usually 5 to 5.5 million tons per year, January through August, only 245,000 tons, and not much optimism that it's going to improve here October, November, December. There's been production problems in Egypt. There's been production problems in Brazil. So globally, nitrogen has been very, very tightly supplied, but because farm economics have been so poor, nobody really wanted to be the one that pushed the price needle. Well, we got an India tender, which is proving that the market is very tightly supplied. Values were starting to kind of rumor around there, starting to show its hand, and then Iran attacked, and that was the last straw. So it wasn't the cause, it was the trigger.
Thank you to Susan Littlefield and Josh Linville for that interview. This is the AgNet News Hour, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
Wrapping up with news today, the first U.S. drought monitor for October indicates varying impacts to crops and commodities within growing drought coverage areas. Rod Bain reports.
While U.S. drought coverage rose slightly on a national basis over the month of September, USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says behind that is a disparity of weather conditions, ranging from the winds and heavy rains of Hurricane Helene impacting the southeast to hot, dry conditions in much of the remainder of the country. Likewise, a look at the October 1st U.S. drought monitor regarding crops and commodities in drought also reflects this divergence, starting with corn and soybeans.
As of October 1st, we have more than 1/4 of our U.S. corn and soybean production areas in drought, 27% for corn, 26% for soybeans.
Numbers up from 13% for corn, 19% for beans in drought to start September, and a low coverage area of 4% for both in summer.
We got most of that Midwestern crop season through without huge impacts, hence still looking at those record yield expectations for both corn and soybeans.
As winter wheat planting begins in several parts of the country,
44% of the winter wheat production area in the United States is in drought. It's actually down a little bit from the beginning of September, 52%. That is largely due to drought easing or eradicating rains that occurred in the lower Midwest and the Mid-South.
The 44% winter wheat area in drought for October 1st is still high, according to Rippey.
It does include some of our key production areas across the Great Plains and Northwest. So that is something we'll have to continue to watch.
For other crops and commodities, such as cotton, hay, and cattle, Rippey says these commodities were impacted by worsening drought or Hurricane Helene's precipitation, depending on location.
Overall, U.S. cotton crop 25% in drought on October 1st. That's down from 42% at the beginning of September, wiped out the drought in the southeast, but we still have significant drought in states like Texas and Oklahoma.
While for hay and cattle in drought,
hay in drought 34%. Nationally, that is up from 31% at the beginning of September, but once again, we have seen worsening conditions. Plains, Midwest and West, and outright flooded in parts of the southeast. Cattle in drought 31% at the beginning of October. U.S. cattle inventory in drought at the beginning of September was 24%.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
You hear a lot about yellow corn and white corn, but what about orange corn? A company created by a father and son duo in Indiana wants you to hear a lot more about it in the years to come. CJ Miller has more.
We want to be the leader in nutritionally enhanced corn and maybe someday other crops as well.
And that's Evan Rochford, who co-founded NutriMaize with his father, Dr. Torbert Rochford, who's an agronomy professor at Purdue. He says his father came up with the idea for orange corn in order to bring vitamin A and other nutrients to those in other parts of the world, such as Africa.
And a lot of people did not think that they would be able to develop varieties that had high enough vitamin A levels to actually make a difference in Africa. Most people said, you're never going to be able to do it with natural variation. Torbert proved him wrong. He found the variation. Him and his collaborators identified key genes that are present in corn, natural variation, and they're able to use those to breed varieties that have much, much higher levels of vitamin A. So it's been a tremendously successful scientific innovation.
Evan says the goal is also to bring orange corn to the masses through the Professor Torbert brand.
We have grits, cornmeal, corn flour. All of those are available on Amazon or on our website, which is professortorberts.com. And people describe them as being creamy, as having a rich flavor.
He says that NutriMaize has also been working to provide their orange corn as poultry feed for egg producers. The corn not only provides more nutrients for both the animal and the egg, but it also gives the egg yolks a darker color and a richer flavor.
We're able to increase the nutritional density of the eggs. We're able to improve the health of the birds.
You can find the full list of retail products available through the Professor Torbert's Orange Corn brand. Their website, professortorberts.com. Also check out the NutriMaize Company website at nutrimaize.com. I'm CJ Miller.
That's today's top agriculture news. I'm Sabrina Halverson. Thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Also look for Sabrina Halverson on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.